Welcome. We've got a session now on the issues of sustainability. Sustainability in the sense of environmental, equitable, social, and of course, economic sustainability of the development patterns that we are pursuing. I think I will just briefly introduce the panelists. Jyoti Parikh, who is Executive Director of IRADE, Integrated Research and Action for Development, and has been in this field for 40 years, 30 years, 20 years. We're old colleagues, and we've worked on many areas together. Then on my left, I have Shivani Ghosh. She's a fellow at the Center for Policy Research. And then we have Syed Kamal, who is Senior Analyst at the Center for Research and Information in Bangladesh. I am Ashok Khosla, and I work at Development Alternatives, which is a 35-year-old organization that has been working primarily on these issues of sustainability for a very long time. I believe that what we are asked to do here is to look at what are the strategies that will help us fulfill the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the UN 2030 Agenda. What we want to look at is not only the criteria and the characteristics of the solutions that are needed in order to make life better for all, but also perhaps some examples of how these have been achieved in the past. The SDGs are a remarkable achievement in many ways. To get all the heads of government and state together and sign on a document agreeing to commitments of this type is an enormously difficult undertaking. And over a period of 3 years of hard work, the UN actually managed to get together a bunch of goals, the SDGs, 17 of them in grosso modo terms, and agreed to them. There were many political hurdles on the way, and to tell you the truth, to some extent, they are the lowest common denominator, but in the sense that things did have to be left out which were inconvenient to one member or another in the General Assembly. However, it is actually quite remarkable how high that lowest common denominator is. They covered pretty well all the major issues that needed to be covered. And what I think is important is to recognize just that each country must see this as the basic minimum and then add on to it its own particular circumstances to expand on them. These goals are formulated quite carefully, but they have issues of intra-se contradictions, and the need for systemic look at them is becoming more and more obvious to show that, to lead to results that basically are optimal not just for one particular goal, but for the whole set of goals together. In one sense, these goals, if you look at them from a 50,000-foot view, are not very different from what Mahatma Gandhi saw as a future for the world. They are explicitly concerned with not leaving anyone behind, what Gandhiji called putting the last first, Antodaya. This is a very precise formulation of equity that I think the UN for the first time made a commitment to. Fairness, social fairness and justice. Polluter pays, which means taking responsibility for those things we do to nature and to each other. precautionary principles, low risk, minimizing risks, and doing those things that don't leave behind a scarred footprint. I myself was very deeply involved with the process of formulating the SDGs, and between the first day of dealing with them and the last, we were able to introduce a large number of concerns about resources. I happen to be the chairman of the International Resource Panel, so it was easy to work with the process. And I believe that the issue of climate change, biodiversity, species extinction, and actually material resources is going to confront humankind in ways that will certainly be a major limit to fulfilling its aspirations. And the goals do deal with a large number of those. I would say that the goals deal with the 4 E's: the equity issue, the environment issue, the economic efficiency issue, and the empowerment issue in pretty solid ways. If we can manage these 4 sets of issues through strategies to fulfill the goals, the world will be certainly a better place. But ultimately, it's not just a goal, but it's a process. And the process, I think, is very important because it depends on how well we nurture the diversity and the strength of the social fabric and maintain it well beyond 2030. How we manage the diversity of nature and the support system, the ecological support systems, and conserve them. It depends on the portfolio of economic choices that are available to different kinds of people in different groups with different aspirations. And above all, I think it is concerned, and perhaps the SDGs are weakest here, with the individual human, the happiness and the fulfillment that each one of us aspires to. But I think those would hopefully come out of fulfilling the other ones. One has to recognize one big missing link in the SDGs, and that is that no matter how efficient we are in the use of our resources, how conserving we are of nature's bounty, how well we manage, we are now, with heading for 9 or 10 billion people on the planet, not going to be able to have a sustainable world unless a certain amount of reduction takes place among those who overconsume. In other words, not only do we need efficiency, but we also need sufficiency. We need a certain ceiling beyond which people do not have to feel they can lead better lives by using more and more resources. And this issue of sufficiency was basically not tenable in the UN discussions, and so basically it was just swept under the rug. The issues that we're going to deal with, certainly the basic needs: the food security, the water, the jobs, the shelter, and of course the things that really count: education, healthcare, participation, freedom. Some of the latter ones are not so easy to deal with on an international basis, and were left to countries to decide. And then we've got to deal with the myths that come with the different ideologies and different economic systems. It is pretty clear that the kind of economic pathways we've employed in the past, which lead to huge disparities, to huge destruction of natural resources, to, on the basis of a notional trickle-down, leave large numbers of people behind. Population growth, which is rapid primarily because a lot of people got left behind. And an attitude that resources are infinitely available. These are all myths that we've got to be very careful about. The solutions, certainly, solutions lie in many areas with modifications that have led to the problems. Markets are not necessarily bad, it's just that we've used them very badly. Production systems, large scale, big projects, big factories, big roads, big dams, these are all have their possible place, but the future, I believe, is going to be with smaller and decentralized systems. Consumption patterns are going to have to change, partly for that sufficiency issue that I just talked about, and partly because the dematerialization needed is going to come from a very different kind of consumption. So I am going to ask my colleagues, the three of them, to give us some ideas about how these kinds of end goals, the SDGs, and the process that I just described to get to them can be done with the help of think tanks. What are the kinds of issues that only think tanks can address and the way they address them? Remember that a large part of the issues of this session came from civil society. They came from think tanks. They were originated and first identified by think tanks. It is not governments or corporations who are looking for a change. They're happy with the status quo. They're not going to come in and say, we've got to reduce consumption. Certainly not corporates and not most governments. They're not really going to talk about sufficiency. They will talk about efficiency because that's a good profit-making approach. But the fact of the matter is that we need both. We need to do things that the existing mainstream economic sectors, particularly business and government, are not going to address. So the think tank becomes almost singularly essential for saving the future for our children and their children. So we have a very big responsibility, and I'd like to ask my colleagues whether they can help us figure out how to ensure that responsibility. I think each of you has, like I did, 7 to 8 minutes. You're welcome. Jyoti, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Ashok. Sustainable development is a philosophy for society, and it lays down some rules about how global society and national pathways should be selected so that we have the long-term goals that we need. Now, sustainable development goals is one aspect of sustainable development. It is not sustainable development itself, but some goals which can at least ensure a large part of the things that we want. And sustainable development goals from 1 to 17, you find that 1 to 7 or 8 are about basic needs of poorest people in the society, and they include hunger, basic needs, as Ashok mentioned, hunger, poverty, education, health, energy access, and these are the goals which many countries have achieved, many have not, but we are still talking about 5% to 25 to 30% of the people there, and there is a lot of need for managing that transition for the lowest bottom. But the sustainable development does not rest there. It's a first and necessary step, but not sufficient. We need to go beyond and look at what we are doing to the rest of the earth also. And in India, for example, and here these SDGs have a lot of role of the public policy. And for example, in India, we have LPG movement, Ujjwala program, which reached a very large number of households which were untouched, and that progress was very slow, census after census. You did not find LPG or going up, and suddenly we have a large coverage of people who can get clean fuel, access to clean fuel, as well as electricity. So it requires infrastructure, investments, and a public policy. But and that also these 7 goals, many of them require a large government role in it. Requires also think tanks to motivate them to find ways to upscale, and there are, we should say, in India, we are registered societies, are all considered NGOs, and we think of think tanks as a subset of NGO. So some of these NGOs are grassroots level NGOs, and they are working at the village level, and they are they know that particular village society. Whereas people, some of the think tanks, like we also have research and action for development. Whenever we feel this policy needs a lot of grassroots level inputs, we collaborate with those NGOs, and we get whatever we need to know from them through surveys and through visits there, and talk to people and so on. So that NGO to think tank collaboration is a very vital aspect for these goals. So we can also think of going from door to door. These NGOs perform tasks which needed to work with village institutions like panchayat, schools, health centers, and so on. And so they are so among themselves, they need a lot of cross-learning. So where the think tanks come is that this cross-learning between 2 different grassroots level NGOs, which may be working, one may be working in Andhra Pradesh, another in Karnataka, and we can bring them together, plus whatever their experience is there, we can bring into government policy. So these are the ways you can do that. Now from the action 9 on, 8 onwards actually, you have life on land, life on sea, climate change. These agendas require different sort of approach, and again, government is always involved, but sometimes private sector, sometimes and the different stakeholders. There's a need to bridge them, and that is the way also to think that how one can bridge them. Climate change is one area in which, at least in India, think tanks have made a lot of contribution. Think tanks have continuously kept that thing going since 1992. I think that the pathways, for example, Paris Agreement required some modeling to do till 2030 and then later on to 2050. So Terry and our organization, IRA, they were called and how to formulate such a model. So that sort of work is needed, which takes care of the current status of technology, our economic growth aspiration, what's the global constraints of carbon space, and so on. Another area is, of course, biodiversity, and that is a big gap. Very few people work there, like World Wildlife Fund and IUCN and so on. But when you see Australia, 10 million hectares of forest gone and millions of biodiversity getting lost, and there is not even I don't think that there is enough outreach for people to come on the street yet, and that's little discerning thought. We need to think of think tanks as bridging the gaps between grassroots level NGO. There are now many types of NGOs in the climate change also. They say RINGO, INGO, but INGO is international NGO, RINGO is regional NGOs, and so on. But we need to aggregate at various levels. So, and many times regional NGOs together can work out a regional strategy, maybe South Asia or Southeast Asia or Asia, and that way they can. Actually, building bridges is a major job of think tanks in various ways, in conceptual sense, in action sense, in policy need, technology change, and that's where its linkage with private sector is very helpful. I mean, again, to give since we are working on the space of gender and energy access, so bring in electric cooking, for example. The induction cooker is plates is marketed as an urban product, so it's very difficult to use it for a rural person. It has no Hindi name, no Hindi instructions, and yet it is quite useful, as we could show with an example of 100 households, and now it is taking a big shape recently. But earlier, LPGs should not be the only source of clean energy access, is what we feel. I think I do think that looking far ahead is also a think tank's job. Otherwise, day-to-day matters people keep solving, but finally, where does it all lead to is something one has to work out in terms of resources, in terms of technology need, in terms of manpower need, and so on. And that those pathways also can be major contributions by think tanks. And with this, I think my first contribution.
Thank you.
Then
Thank you, Jyoti. Now, may I invite Shivani to take the floor?
Thank you so much. Since we just have 7 minutes, I'll jump right in. My background is I'm an environmental lawyer, so I'm going to use that kind of my specialization. I actually even practice in the courts in India. So I'm going to use that specialization to kind of focus it really down to 3 things, which I really think are important to at least achieve some part of the SDGs, certainly not all of them, but there are these 3 areas which I believe need a lot of focus in India right now, if you're looking at environmental conservation and protection as one of our important goals, national goals. And those 3 are, first, that we need to align our policies with clearly defined environmental outcomes. Second, that our laws and regulations have to be properly designed and have to be much more stronger to achieve those identified environmental outcomes. And finally, that our regulatory institutions, in particular the environmental regulatory institutions, need to be adequately strengthened, have the staff, have the ability to actually implement and enforce what the law and regulation expects from them. So those are really the 3 things I'd just like to focus on. And of course, there's so much more we could talk about, but I thought these 3 things could perhaps have some more kind of meat to, add some little more meat to the discussion. And I do believe in all these 3 think tanks, academic and research organizations, as well as grassroots level NGOs have a very important role to play in really contributing to all these 3 in very specific ways. To begin with, to give specific examples with regard to why I think environmental outcomes is where we really need to focus. If you look at the way the Air Act, the law that governs the air pollution regulation in India, which was enacted in 1981, if you look at that law right now, it's really designed to regulate point sources of pollution, so industries, power plants, because perhaps in 1980s and 70s, that was where the air pollution was arising from. Whereas dispersed sources of air pollution, such as vehicular traffic, construction dust, landfills burning, were not really the focus of the policymakers, the focus of policymakers at that point, and therefore the Air Act doesn't really address those issues very well. Therefore, we have to really now realign the air quality regulation to look at proper ambient air quality, improved ambient air quality, rather than looking at regulating specific point sources of air pollution. And therefore, environmental outcomes should be defined as what quality of air do we want to breathe, as opposed to how many industries can we allow in a particular area could perhaps be a way in which we need to realign our environmental outcomes. Secondly, I believe our environmental outcomes, when we are designing them, they cannot be secondary to other extraneous influences, such as we cannot say that ease of doing business should be running our environmental policies. And there are several environmental circulars and notifications that have been issued by the government in recent years, which really say that we are issuing this environment policy because it will reduce the cost of doing business. And in my sense, that is not really the job of an environmental regulation. That could perhaps, of course, be the job of an industrial policy regulation, but not the job of, or the objective of an environmental regulation. So if we don't actually align the objective of an environmental regulation properly, then we are kind of heading towards, the misalignment is certainly heading towards a failed regulation, not achieving the environmental outcomes. Secondly, moving to examples of why I think we need better law and regulation, environmental law and regulation. We really need to design, or perhaps in many cases redesign, entirely rethink the way our regulatory framework is currently in force. And I, of course, gave the example of the Air Act. But another example would be many of us who are witnessing this horrible, national emergency of air pollution across the northern states of India. It's not, of course, a national capital problem, but it's actually a problem across a regional belt of the Indo-Gangetic Plains. But the truth of the matter is that the regulatory framework, the way it's been designed, actually is very state-centric, and we need to rethink and redesign it so that it actually looks at an entire airshed as an approach to managing air quality or improving air quality, rather than looking at geographical jurisdictions of states and districts and cities or urban areas. We really need to rethink our air law in that sense. Also, I believe and I think this is something that the SDGs also do focus a lot on, is about increasing public participation in our environmental decision-making. Very few laws right now actually state in letter that there has to be public consultation. I'm not talking about actually in practice. For instance, the environmental impact assessment process and the environment clearance process requires a public consultation, which doesn't take place properly. But there are many other areas of environmental regulation which actually entirely exclude people who are going to get affected by a particular environmental decision from being part of the process from an effective stage, not from something that's post facto, too late. They perhaps can raise a grievance, but it's already a fait to comply, and they can't even do much about it. So I think it's very important that our regulatory framework actually actively encourages effective public participation. And the final point under this issue that I'd raise is the importance that we need to move, that we should consider with regard to transparency and accountability. India is very proud of its right to information law that it brought into force in 2005. We, in fact, say we have the fundamental right to information. But really, in practice, our laws and regulation are not designed in a way that important data about environmental factors, indicators, monitors, inspections, anything. Most of that is not available freely, not easily accessible, and really there needs to be a move towards increased transparency across the board in environmental regulation and the implementation of environmental regulation. And also, of course, accountability. A lot of people are asking questions about we've had important Supreme Court judgments come through since 1990s, taking into account how bad the situation of the air quality in India, in Delhi specifically is, and yet in 2020 we are still discussing how bad the air quality in Delhi is. And I'm sorry to focus on Delhi because really I'm just using it as an example, but the truth is there are people who need to be held accountable for actually failing to do what was clearly they were asked to do or was expected to do. And I believe that there is some real need to improve accountability for failure or really neglect by policymakers and government officials, lawmakers for performing what is expected from them under the Constitution as well as the laws. Finally, with regard to stronger environmental regulatory institutions, I think this is really where the buck stops. I mean, you could have really strong laws, but if you don't have people to implement those laws, you can't really do much. For example, I mean, recently I was just looking at the website of the Punjab Pollution Control Board. Punjab is the state where a lot of the crop burning is taking place, the residue burning is taking place, which is being considered to be one of the reasons why the National Capital Region is affected by air pollution. And it is running at some 30% vacancies. And the Pollution Control Board is at 30% vacancies of actually sanctioned posts. So we don't even know if the sanctioned posts are adequate, but even assuming the sanctioned posts in that regulatory institution are adequate, they are running at very high vacancy rates. For example, the National Green Tribunal, which is our premier environmental grievance redressal forum, our environmental court, which is supposed to have which is supposed to have judicial as well as expert members to be able to tackle issues of environmental legal issues in a kind of a holistic manner. We did not have a chairperson of the tribunal for several months. And right now it's really just has 5 judicial members, 4 expert members, which is less than 30% of what it's supposed to have. And it's therefore most of its benches across the country are unable to function. So the premier institution that the parliament of this country has set up to resolve our environmental concerns is running at really suboptimal levels, and that really speaks for how much importance we are giving to our environmental institutions. So I think all these kind of factors really go towards telling us how soon or how well can SDGs really be, met, or we can try to meet them. And apart from just the vacancies and the personnel in the institutions, also what are the powers that these institutions have? Do they have the expertise? Do they have the capacity? Are they in a position to proportionately respond? I mean, and air pollution is a national emergency. I mean, and no one here in the room would deny that. But do our pollution control boards have the capacity to actually deal with that emergency? Or does even our Ministry of Environment have the capacity to deal with that kind of an emergency? I really doubt that. So this is just kind of giving examples to these 3 issues that I think are important. And I do believe that in each of these 3, of course, there's a lot more to be said, academic institutions, think tanks can really play a role by providing the basic research. How many prosecutions have taken place under the Air Act, Water Act to convict people who are responsible for pollution? How much does it, you mentioned polluter pays principle, how much does it cost to restore a polluted pond? We know the government doesn't have the capacity to actually do that, but there are institutions which do have the capacity. How much would it cost? Because just throwing numbers out and saying, okay, you give 5 lakh rupees, maybe it's an entirely disproportionate amount of a penalty that has been imposed on someone. So I think there's a lot that institutions can do and contribute, and I hope this can be used as something like a conversation starter now.
Thank you. Very good. Next, can I invite Syed to take the floor?
Thank you. Afternoon hours, everyone's tired, it seems like. So when I saw the panel, I was like, why am I in it? But turns out I was thinking that because I'm a Bangladeshi, and Bangladesh is one of the very few countries which actually quite successfully and virtually completed the MDGs successfully, despite the fact that it didn't have much say in it while framing it, unlike the SDGs where there was a lot of participation and much more democratic process. So then I thought, yeah, okay, that might make a little bit of sense, There is truly, Bangladesh, I think, is an example, not because I'm from there, but because some of the pointers say that, and it has truly been pretty much an exclusive growth story. And there are many examples too, and indicators, data that you can prove it through. But I think what is important to realize is we're already 4 years into the journey to 2030. So it's not that we should think what should be done, or how things should be strategized. I think it's like, what are we doing and what has been done already? Time to hold the first step. That 2021 is the first big step when you are holding the governments and the countries accountable to whether have you taken the first step to 2030. So I would like to point out some things, some steps that Bangladesh has taken, and think tanks in Bangladesh and civil society organizations really gave their input into it. Many of the plans, similar to how SDG was framed, because I remember being in New York in UN headquarters. I used to work there then, and they were really inclusive. So I think that's how a lot of strategies were taken has been taken in Bangladesh. One thing that has been done in, I think, Bangladesh government and the think tank sector has done well is they came up with a plan called the Delta Plan. And it is a plan that looks into the long-term strategies of a country. So it's called Delta Plan 2100. So you can see it gives a year account. And the point being that, as we have seen, as we've heard, that sustainable development has to be a long-term strategy. And Delta Plan recognizes that Bangladesh is a delta. So it's the reality of the situation that you cannot escape. And it inculcates climate change and water resource management as part of every policy-making decision, including resource allocation. So every 2% of all resource allocations into every sector and every areas that will go are going into issues of climate change and water resource management. So, really putting and climate change is a real problem in a delta country like Bangladesh, a low-lying delta country like Bangladesh. So the point being, like, really putting your resources where the need is. Then the part of the Delta Plan says that, by 2030, Bangladesh has to finish off, has to eradicate extreme poverty. So that is very possible, because right now the extreme poverty rate in Bangladesh is around 11 to 15%, depending on how you look at it. And the moderate poverty, the real poverty rate is almost 30%. So because of the elasticity difference, I think extreme poverty eradication is very possible. So to do that, for example, and since we are talking about strategies, the government and the think tank industry worked on something called National Social Security Strategy, basically social protection. And for a country like Bangladesh, that's very, like, you're talking about what happened in America with the New Deal, basically. So a country like Bangladesh thinking about a New Deal in, while it is not in that same developmental stage, I think it's a bold step. So what has it done? It took almost 5 years to be formulated, and within 3 years of implementation, it has gone into bringing almost like 12 to 15 million people under the protection. Yes, the per capita investment into it is very small, but nonetheless, it's like, $2 per month to a disabled person or a climate change refugee. It's not a lot, but the point being the structure has been set and it can be fueled in more. So that's one way of uplifting people from poverty that I think will be very effective. And instead of giving subsidies, instead of giving any other way of battling poverty, I think the government has realized that my resources are limited, and I have to pour it in some strategic way, and that's the strategy that's applied. So whether it's going to be eventually successful or not, we don't know. In terms of, I think, as I said, Bangladesh is one of the very few countries which have virtually achieved the MDGs pretty successfully, and with the growth trajectory increasing over the years, in last 15 years. Right now, the growth, the GDP growth in Bangladesh is nearly 8%. So it has been incrementally increasing over the years, in last 15 years. But the thing is, good story is it prioritizes certain things. It prioritizes public health instead of advanced healthcare. And anyone who is in India would know that a lot of Bangladeshis come here for advanced healthcare. But in terms of public health, if you look at the indicators, child mortality rate reduction, maternal mortality rate reduction, Bangladesh has done fairly better than even many states in India, most states in India, and overall India. The birth rate is almost close to 2.1%, just 2.2% I think it is, so almost replacement rate. So this has, whereas Bangladesh used to be a very, very high birth rate country. So I'm sure folks here who have been tracking, who works on the development sector knows the challenges of bringing those things down in, say, in about 10 years' time. So about SDGs, I think the same approach has been taken, as I said, with SDGs in Bangladesh, that it has taken it seriously, the government has initially mapped out its resources, that yeah, we cannot do everything. And I'll come to the point, I'll come to the areas where the government is not looking into, and we can do all, policy is not adopted. For example, in a country like Bangladesh, anything that is to be taken seriously goes into policy action. Any policy action that's to be taken seriously goes to what we call PMO, Prime Minister's Office, because most of the executive work that can be done gets done very faster there. So the first thing, as soon as the Bangladesh, the Agenda 2030 was signed in, was open up a cell in Prime Minister's Office, and basically appoint the highest level of bureaucrat, highest and most experienced bureaucrat at the head of the cell. Then the action was a little bit on the governance side. That was basically it decided that Bangladesh was very behind digitization, so it decided that all government services will be digitized. And right now you'll see in Bangladesh almost more than 50% of the government services are digitized, which is a lot in saying in 5 years' time that, no, a bit more than 5 years, about 7 years' time, digitizing half of government services took a lot of effort. Energy sector, it was an energy poor country right now. Believe it or not, Bangladesh is pretty much energy sufficient, especially in the urban areas. Rural areas get some lack of energy, but that's not because of a lack of production, that's because of overproduction and what we call load shedding. You have to shed the loads. But what I think is interesting for example, from a sustainability point of view is in the energy sector is Bangladesh is one of the few countries which is seriously experimenting with off-grid energy. So maybe we were talking about centralization, command and doing everything from the top. In Bangladesh, there are many examples where people have just decided that, we are not going to be connected to the central grid. We are just going to do off-grid energy. So there are many ways that's being done. And so that gives a bit of central energy independence to the communities. And so that's and one of the ways you can look at it is what we call in Bangladesh called solar home system revolution. So basically you basically set up solar system on your rooftop and basically put a battery and try to get as much energy, use as much energy from your own production. And Bangladesh has the highest number of it. So in the world, there are about 8 million of them, and Bangladesh almost have more than 5 million, so more than 50% of them. So, and this has been done in a period of about 5 to 6 years. So you see, what I'm trying to say is there are specific actions and strategies that is being taken, and it's and understanding that that it cannot do everything. A country like Bangladesh. For example, right now what has not been successful is the healthcare system in Bangladesh. So the next strategy for the government should be, I think, and government is partially adopting it, is universal healthcare. So developing country like Bangladesh adopting universal healthcare is a difficult task, but I think it has adopted it. We'll see by 2025 how that turns out. And so these are the development indicators. I think what another part of it, of the equation of sustainable development is basically growth. So Bangladesh, I think, has finally realized that, okay, we have done development indicators for a long time. We have worked on public health issues, but now I think it has to become more than a development laboratory to an investment laboratory. So I think what has happened, you will see if you track the economic growth data, that Bangladesh has been growing a lot lately. So that's because the government has started investing in mega infrastructure. That's a priority for the government. It has set up an investment board, which has pretty much opened up a one-stop shop in the country, which is you have to go to basically one place to set up a business or do an investment instead of going to different offices. And what it has done is it has planned to open almost 100 industrial zones, economic zones, what they are calling, throughout the country to industrialize. It's almost same to the Shenzhen model in China. And some of them have already been set up, and many of them, they have been strategically targeted. Actually, there are 3 of them which are Indian invested economic zones.
Yeah.
We're done?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll finish it off. What I'm saying is we have, in a country like Bangladesh, these are the steps it has taken, but what it has not taken and not addressed is things like skills gap. So there's a big skill gap. Environmental issues larger, the urban development, and basically it is the biggest fear that it has, and I am not sure it will overcome, even with the achievement of SDG, is what we call the middle income trap. And yeah, so that's the challenges before a country like Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to curtail you, because Bangladesh is really an interesting story, and as Sayed just said, on many fronts it is really a world leader, including the home solar systems, the water management systems. So I would love to give you more time, but I think we're going to have to stop very soon. We've got 10 minutes, and we do need to invite people to participate. Is there anybody who would like to have the floor? Yes, sir.
Thank you. The topic is very fine, and issues discussed very nice, and I like to share my views with you, that the topic is based on neoclassical economics. It's not based on neoclassical economics, because profit maximization, utility maximization is not done here, because resource given. And our development will be taking place with the help of the given resources. So here, to solve the problem, I think, and all of you also think about the political economy plays an important role. And here, without political will of the political leaders, you cannot find how to destroy, how to reduce the destructions of the resources. For example, in the case of the forest sector, and you know that although the government has several policies are there, ma'am noted the Ujjwala program, there are many programs like the MG Narega program are there. So all programs are there, but people who are dependent on the forest resource, they are exploiting their destruction of the forest resource for their poverty, etc., etc. But there are no alternative employment opportunities there. Although there are so many projects, so many policies of the governments are taking place. So problem is the governance. So implementation, there is a basic difference between the practice, science and the practice. We have some programs, policies are there, but nothing has been implemented properly. That is, my question is that how the political parties, how the NGOs, how the think tank groups, and so other village level institutions can combat these issues, negative issues.
Thank you. It's very useful. Any other comments? Yes, madam.
If I may? Okay, thank you. My name is Maaike Okene-Heijmans. I work at the Klingendael Institute in The Hague. Thank you for 3 very interesting presentations, and it's remarkable to be in Delhi and to hear about the Delta Plan in Bangladesh, because of course this is the name of our master plan on dealing with the water, developed in the 1950s, and I believe the Dutch government has a role also in Bangladesh. So thank you for enlightening me about that even here. And my question is about different actors that are important in this field, and the first 2 speakers, of course, focused on the role of NGOs, first of all, and then on the role of laws and regulation in trying to achieve what has been identified as SDGs. And I'm wondering whether this is focus on what seems to me preventing negative impact can really suffice. In other words, how about the impact or the focus on creating positive impact by working with what are, of course, the big polluters, the private sector? I've hardly heard the private sector mentioned here, and they are, of course, the ones that we are dealing with. I wonder whether we might not be more effective in seducing them to do better. The Indian government, I believe, is focusing on responsible business conduct, and I know the Dutch government has been working with them. Also to gain benefits from crop burning and to show the negative sides of it, and to work with farmers who engage in this in doing different by working with them. So this is very business to business, almost facilitation, and I wonder whether you could elaborate on that a little bit also.
Thank you. There was one more. Yes, madam.
Thank you. Madina, once again. I like the discussion, but I wanted to hear more about how can our budgets, our national budgets, be more responsive to priorities, because everything is a priority in our government. And because lack of priority within priority makes us have so many divergent programs. And then the issue is the coordination. Because I know we might have limited budgets, but even within that limited budget, if well coordinated within the programming, I think we can achieve some of these issues. So we, on the other side, as civil servants, or as at the micro level, we need to see responsive budgeting at the national level that can reprioritize some of these issues. And I think it's because we are everywhere and then we are nowhere. When you are trying, then you see the issues of environment. While they are really emphasized in the planning phase, in implementation phase, it's the third objective and often overlooked. After infrastructure, then environment is left out. So and then the issues around saving the planet are overlooked in implementation.
Okay, now we have run out of time. I think if you have a very short, quick intervention, like half a minute, we can allow that. Otherwise, I will ask. Yes, sir.
No, I think it is too much diffused. I think we talked of regulators, but there is a capture of regulators. But my question there is that so much of diffusion has taken place. So there is an idea, why can't we have SDG champions so that we can bring everything there at one place and we can integrate and then can move forward.
Thank you. We have about 1.5 minutes each panelist. Could we start with Jyoti? Would you like to respond to any of these comments?
No, I think you mentioned about business to business. Of course, there are many business organizations and they work also, but sometimes what needs is also a scrutiny of their practices and whether certain, there are gaps also between the stakeholders, the perspectives. And that, I'm talking about the role of think tank, which is, that's where think tanks can look at whatever we do, we look at multi-stakeholder chain from consumers to resource people, and then policy implementers, the regulators, and so on. So when you look at this chain, what are the gaps between one sort of key holders to the another? And for example, there was some issue of biodiesel. So there are farmers who will grow it, then there are intermediate people who purchase it. What is the price expectation? What is the global prices? What are the issues in aggregating? What should the government do in terms of infrastructure availability, so on. So to make the whole solution, maybe whether it's technological solution or regulatory solution or whatever, what is it that's needed? That's
Thank you. Shivani, would you like to?
Just a quick response. I'm really glad you raised the issue of prioritization in policy making, because I think all policymakers and all of us who are outside the government also are always stuck with that issue that you want to do 20 different things, but you have a very limited pot of money. I think there actually think tanks do have a very important role to play to help policymakers come up with important multiple criteria analysis, where you can have several important questions, which I think ma'am was also leading to, which can help you prioritize in a very reasoned manner, because there's no doubt you'll have to let go of some of the very laudable objectives, but you just don't have the money, time, space, resources to do it. But I think that necessary prioritization should also take place in a very robust process. I think the process is very important. And therefore, to be able to explain why you chose X over Y, even if Y has long-term benefits but very little short-term benefits, I think that prioritization process is something that think tanks can really help policymakers kind of develop and answer.
Thank you. Sayed, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I think again I'll go. Yes, I think the Delta Plan was aided by the Dutch government. Actually, I think their experience kind of helped Bangladesh quite a bit. I think this is what's important. I think best practices need to be borrowed and provided. So in terms of coordination, I just wanted to say one thing, that priorities, of course, have to be set, but then how to coordinate that. So in that case, I don't think there is any secondary thing to political will. So it has to come from the highest level of leadership.
Thank you. Well, we've come to the end of a very interesting session. It's pretty clear that if we're going to have an outcome that brings about a world there that we can be proud to leave to our children and grandchildren, things are going to have to be tightened up. And a large part of this seems to be partly because most people, including decision makers, know what needs to be done, but they don't get around to doing it. And this whole issue of implementation, prioritization, allocating budgets is where it's going to be. It seems to me that think tanks have not only the job of creating new ideas and new solutions, but acting as very strong monitors and whistleblowers, if you like, for making sure that the priorities are being implemented. If they're not, then there is virtually no other watchdog in society that has the intellectual means to be able to call their bluff. Universities are not too good at doing this. It's really the independent think tanks that have the job to monitor and evaluate and essentially blow the whistle where it's needed. So thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting session, and I want to thank the organizers for having given us this opportunity.